It is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Andrew Johnson. He received his Ph.D. in anthropology at Cornell University in 2010, and the title of his dissertation was Rebuilding Lana, Consuming and Constructing the Past in Urban Northern Thailand. Since then, he's held a number of different positions at different universities, beginning with Sogang University in Korea, then at National University of Singapore, then at Columbia University, at Yale-NUS College in Singapore, at Princeton University, and now he is presently a visiting scholar at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at University of California-Berkeley. He's written quite a few different articles, which I won't get into too much detail about, but I'd like to mention his two books and his present project. His first book was published in 2014 through University of Hawaii Press, and that was titled Ghosts of the New City, Spirits, Urbanism, and the Ruins of Progress in Chiang Mai. And then most recently, and this is the actual book that inspired me to want to invite Andrew to speak with us, is called Mekong Dreaming, Life, Life and, I can't read my old handwriting here.
Death, I think.
Yeah, breath, that's right, yes, along a changing river, sorry. He also has another present project that he's working on, or he hopes to get back to once the COVID-19 crisis is over, and that's tentatively called Floodlines, Wastewater, and Urban Aspirations in Bangkok's Canals. And that also sounds like a really promising project. I often notice in Bangkok when you're walking around there and you see these monitor lizards and in the canals and all kinds of different life there that you might not expect to find in a very urban space. Anyway, I think I'll leave it at that and invite Andrew to take us away with his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. And first off, is any technical difficulties? Can everybody hear me okay? It's a real pleasure to get to talk to Wisconsin, Madison, and because I think the Center for Southeast Asian Studies there is a place that every scholar of Southeast Asian Studies kind of has some sort of interaction with. And I did 2 summers at CIASI, or 1 summer at CIASI, 1 summer sort of hanging around CIASI. And it's just to be able to kind of be back here even virtually is just a real pleasure. And so thanks to the center for inviting me, and thanks Ian for your introduction. And this has been just a real pleasure. So without further ado, I'm going to get into it. And today, what I'm going to be talking about is all material that was in my second book, which is Mekong Dreaming, Life and Death Along a Changing River. I need to remember the title after the colon myself. So I'll just get into it then. So this year, as many of you who follow Mekong issues might know, the annual backflow of the Mekong ceased or was delayed for quite some time. The great river, flooded by monsoon rains, normally turns back upon itself in Cambodia as it fills the Tonle Sap Lake. But this year, something else happened. The reasons for this change in the river have to do with a complicated mixture of hydrology and geopolitics. You can look at this by looking at national priorities, economic agendas. We could look at the Mekong River Commission, which is an international organization of Mekong states that looks to manage and profit from the river's flow. We could frame it as a matter of national development or natural resources that belong to this or that nation, or even as a shared resource to be developed by the region. We could talk about the region as a potential political flashpoint, but I'm an anthropologist, and that means that I zoom in to ask what these changes might mean in the lives of everyday people. And what I argue here is that the crisis in the river affects people at multiple levels. It's a crisis of ecology, of hydrology, of economy, of family, of imagination, of religion. And so in the talk today, I want to take these crises each in turn and examine the change in the river via the perspective of those dwelling next to it in terms of materiality, time, biota, and potency. I've named them a little different on the slide, but you'll see how they line up. The Mekong is one of the largest in the world by drainage. It's the aorta of Southeast Asia. It flows down from the Tibetan Plateau through a series of turbulent rapids out of China, then down to form the border between Laos and Burma, then Thailand and then Laos. And after going over the Con Falls in Laos, it enters Cambodia and flows out through the delta in near Saigon in Vietnam. It's a river split by political boundaries and carries with it a legacy of political conflict and war. And now the area that I'm going to talk to you about today is this gigantic blue circle there on the map, is in the middle Mekong Basin, in between Laos and Thailand. Here, the river, after it comes through the series of turbulent waterfalls and rapids, it flattens out. Some areas still have series of rapids, and I'll talk about those in a little bit, but other reaches become broad and flat. And sometimes what the river looks like is highly dependent upon the time of year. During the monsoon, the water level can jump up to 9 meters, turning what looks like a scrub forest into a broad expanse of water, and then back down to a trickle during the dry season. So historically, large-scale alteration has come to the rivers quite slowly. The Mekong region was a backwater for China, being pretty far from the centers of Han power, and the middle Mekong area has been war-torn for hundreds of years. American audiences might associate the region with Cold War conflicts, the Vietnam War, the Khmer Rouge, and things like this, but cities such as Vientiane were sacked and burned even in the 17 and 1800s as conflicts between Lao and Siamese forces. But change has come to the Great River. Climate change and most significantly hydropower projects have altered its flow dramatically. In the past decade and a half, this has meant the Jinghong hydroelectric dam. Jinghong, Chiang Rung, if you are speaking a Thai language, it's one of a series of dams across the mainstream of the Mekong in China just before it flows over the border into Southeast Asia. In addition to the 7 already built in China, there's over 20 more in the works, including the massive Sayaburi Dam in Laos. Actually, I should put that in the constructed column now, which is just upstream of the district where I'm currently doing field research. Chinese and Lao advocates argue that these dams are necessary to provide clean power to fuel national development, although the real beneficiaries are likely to be the Chinese and Thai construction companies and businesses involved in exporting the power. So while the 19th century French dreams of finding a colonial river route up the Mekong into China were dashed upon finding those Con Falls in Laos, in the 21st century, Beijing has resolved to do something about these barriers to trade, at least those hindering connections between China and Laos, blasting rapids and rocks with the aim of rendering the Mekong, at least in part, navigable to cargo ships. These alterations are happening a long way upstream from the town I call Ban Buk, which is my field site, which is itself a few hours upstream from Vientiane. But the changes in the river, in the water itself, and in the ecology and the hydrology of the river are keenly felt. Gouts of water rush downstream from the river when floodgates open, and when they close, the river can drop to the lowest points ever seen. In April of 2015, during an ebb following one of these recent irregular gluts of water from Jinghong, Bong and I took his boat to look for a lost net. As he guided us through the maze of islands and rocks exposed by the Mekong's retreat, we moved through clumps of bushes with branches bare except for a very thin green line of foliage marking the highest extent of the recent water. These shrubs would ordinarily be submerged for the extent of the rainy season, and then leaf and bear fruit when they're exposed during the dry season, and then be resubmerged in time for the fruits to be eaten and seeds distributed by catfish during the next flood. But the rapid rise and fall of the river gave little time for this. The buds were smothered before they had a chance to grow, and fruit never appeared. The network is in flux, and relations are uncertain. So as he steers the boat through the river's narrow channels, Bong related to me the multiple different techniques that he had used in fishing just 10 years ago that had since stopped working since Jinghong happened. The use of roadkill dog flesh pickled in urine to catch the giant catfish's slightly smaller carnivorous cousin. The use of a drop of opium on a hook for certain kinds of large fish. Spells, kata, that could coax a catfish into the net. A petition to the Naga, a kind of a water dragon. If you're familiar with Southeast Asia, I think you know what I mean, but sort of a large aquatic dragon, to guide fish towards him. A specific request to a divine lord of the fish, Zhao Babu, a spirit who ruled over and managed the local giant catfish, to catch one of his subjects, finding red water, as he described it, in which nets could be invisible to passing fish. So Bong here points at a failure of technique across multiple levels. His own techniques for finding fish, for catching fish, no longer work. These technologies include both those that rely upon material qualities, in other words, being able to read the water, scheduling where and in what season he put his nets, knowing what kinds of fish could be found where, but also his own personal prowess, the spells that he knows, or his relationships with other religious figures, such as this Lord of the Fish or the Naga. For each of these are for Bong, interlinked in the activity of fishing, and each one has failed. So in my book, I look at this sense of loss, and I trace the links between hydropower and what we might call dwelling on the Mekong. The attempt to live with the changed Mekong and its other beings is one that involves negotiating these multiple factors. As I've mentioned, Bong's fishing involves him knowing what time a particular fish would be active, what material bait would draw the fish to him, what traps to set for the fish, but also accessing something else, some further means to ensure that the fish actually come, something from realms that we might call religious or magical, or which I'm just going to call potential. It's my argument that the shifts in the Mekong place each of these qualities in flux. In Mekong Dreaming, I address the material qualities of the Mekong land/waterscape, including its temporality, the water itself, the materiality of the water, the fish, and the changing techniques used to access them, and I go over these briefly today. In the book, what I won't go over today, but is in there, is more details about migrant labor, borders, the productive potential of foreign actors, including spirits, how they play into this change. This, in turn, involves Mekong concepts of time, as time and space become vital to how potential fish become actual fish, and what it means to exist and to dwell in this new landscape. So, the Mekong, where it flows past Banbuk, is in constant motion in 3 directions. Its flow is hypnotic. It normally flows west-east until the monsoons engorge it, and farther downstream in Cambodia, it reverses and flows from east to west. It flows up and down, too. Whirlpools the size of a fist form on the surface with a great sucking sound, travel a few meters downstream, and then dissipate. At the same time, plateaus of water bubble up from underneath. These are expected when the river flows over a great rock, Gang, something I'll talk about in a moment. But many are unpredictable. They form seemingly out of nowhere and disappear into the swirl. There's an endless churn in the red-brown flow. For fishermen, water is a topic of conversation constantly. Water can be little, nai, or much, lai. It runs either red with sediment, dang, or clear, sai, meaning with a visibility of a few inches. Clear is never really clear, at least until Jinghong. At nights of the full moon, those living on its banks report fireballs, bangfai, erupting from the water that they attribute to Nagas living in its depths. The topography of the river is mediated by these rapids, those gang over and under and around which the water flows. One navigates by reference to this or that gang, this or that rock or rapid, which in Banbuk, they each have names and stories. Some of them, like the great Gang Pan, have personalities, and this latter rock, Gang Pan, despite its reputation, its name means cruel rapid, guards the best fishing in the area. A decade ago, the rapid tore the bottom out of a Chinese cargo vessel attempting to go over it, and cargo and oil floated down the river for days. One refers to places in the river with respects to gang or other hydrological features, and one can even talk about the shoreline like this. Bong lives across from Gang Pan. Near Kok He was a Laotian riverside pub near a submerged rapid. Most towns in the river have names derived from such features. Ban Kok Mai, Ban Nong, Ban Kok Wei. Fish also appreciate gang. Crocodile kitfish, kind of a large gunch catfish, I think is the word in English. In Lao, they're just ba he. Stick close to the boulders of a gang in that eddy just next to the rush of water. This suits them. They're ambush predators and sport a nasty-looking mouth of teeth, hence the name. Especially when the current drops in the dry season, these fish are the largest that are regularly caught, although they're nothing compared to the Mekong giant catfish, a fish that I'm going to get into in a moment. This, by the way, is a picture of a gang, and you can see there how the watermark has dropped, how the water line has dropped, and you can even see some of those shrubs I was talking about, with the branches dead in the lower half and alive just at the very top. Sometimes a gang is more than just a rock. A pocket of sand might grow into a beach hut when the water drops. Sometimes larger plants might colonize it and create an actual island, dawn. Released into a broader, flatter stretch after being pinched by gang into a fast few streams, the water might make a slow, churning oval eddy. This long, lazy swirl makes for good hunting with the throw net or a place to fence off part of the river in which to store live fish. More common is a faster, rounder eddy, marking a brief moment of respite between rapids, between gang, where fishermen caught sheepfish, tilapia, or a place to swim. Finally, there are deep, swirling pools, nong, like the one across from the village center. Here's where the water persists in the dry season, where the rest of the river drops to a trickle, and where the water remains relatively still in the wet season, when the gang are raging. Here, too, is where the bookfish, the Mekong giant catfish, live, and from where their divine king, the lord of the fish, ruled. Indeed, a shrine to the lord stood just next to the village center, above the swirling pool. And I should say, in a future article, I'm really interested in sort of indigenous ideas about these deep pools, where they go, where their sources come from, and who or what may have dug the tunnels that run underneath the mountains and things like this. That's a topic for a later time, a later article and things. In short, what I'm trying to get at here is that the ragged topography of the river makes it a nest of distinct places. The variety of vocabulary that you can use to refer to a river is extremely broad. As I go into more detail here, these are places that change depending on the time of year and house a variety of other than human beings. We can talk about fish, but we can also talk about Nagas, spirits, and these sorts of things. These create a social map that marks off space that varies with the level of water, but it's also a political division. Division of the river into distinct places also delineates a system of property ownership, revealing a legal grid that overlays the river. According to a mutual agreement of village heads from either side, from the Lao side and the Thai side, certain places were designated as either public or private, depending on determining who had the right to fish where. These locations, termed luang mong, were also affixed to a particular hydrological feature. The richest fishermen, such as my friend Pong, owned the rights to fish at several sites, and luang mong could be bought, sold, inherited, or leased on a monthly or yearly basis, just as land-based property could. A good one could go for several tens of thousands, about a couple $100 up to $1,000. For those without, a throw net fishing in a public site was an option, or some public boulders like this one that we're standing on here now offered a precarious perch with a dip net. But this local legal map runs into a national one. Lao fishermen claimed the Mekong up to the point where the water meets the Thai shore, and suggested that they were simply being generous neighbors, allowing Thai nationals such as Bong upon the waters, and allowing the whole system of luang mong to persist, the whole system of designated spots in the river to persist. In contradiction, Lao military erected concrete pyramids on Gang midstream, marked another boundary, one that followed the deepest channel. But this, too, was ignored by all involved. Bong crossed this line regularly, and other fishermen crossed this line regularly on their boats, often taking me with them, and went for social engagements in Ban Nguyen in Laos without any kind of paperwork. When I pressed Bong on the competing national definitions of what constitutes Lao or Thai places of the water, something which I was very interested in because I didn't have a research visa for Laos, and I didn't want to get caught on the wrong side of the border, Bong replied simply, "Bokiao. The nations are not applicable here." So claims to plots of water within this border are recognized by no authority higher than the village headman of Banbuk and its Lao neighbor. These two authorities agree upon who owns what at what time and are responsible for adjudicating disputes over them. Here too, the police do not and frankly cannot get involved. A Thai policeman would have questionable authority over property rights claimed by another country, not to mention midstream. However, as I explore elsewhere in the book, such conflicts do indeed erupt, with the Laotian police, Thai military, Thai police, and village heads each pulling in their own separate direction. Thus, the system of nets of Luang Mong constitute another way of seeing ownership and authority in the river, a way of seeing the river as a shared space that has nothing to do with either Bangkok or Vientiane, much less Beijing. This cross-river authority is ruled more by force of personality and custom than legal mandate. But with changes in the water come multiple changes on this exact angle. Rapids, if not blasted, become submerged in a flood or non-navigable in an ebb. And Luang Mong fisheries, these designated spots in the river, have become the hardest hit by recent hydropower projects. When unexpected floods rip through Ban Buk, the most common casualty are the nets strung within these fishing grounds. These nets, already prone to tangling, become a pale blue, unsalvageable mess as they're torn from the eddies in which they float. Most often, they end up in the morning after the flood, stranded atop a boulder with fish too ensnared to be removed, just rotting in the sun. Of these, most nets swept away and stranded were too damaged to be repaired, and these costs constituted the majority of losses from minor floods. Also, boats were certainly lost, occasionally livestock. There were no deaths in Ban Buk that I had heard of, but unfortunately, a few times a year, people would discover bodies in the current. So of the sites, of these designated fishing sites that Bong pointed out to me, many, if not most, were devoid of nets. Here, either nets have been entirely swept away, or equally as often, Bong described the owners as just waiting, la du, before they attempted any more fishing. Some people had lost nets and were waiting to be able to have the time or money to replace them, but some were simply waiting for the instability in the river to be over. Prices for fishing plots and the entire system of mutual ownership had gone into freefall, and recriminations, sometimes village against village, sometimes Lao against Thai, and sometimes simply interpersonal, flared, even turning into, at times, violence. Some, abandoning net fishing, turned towards fishing with electric charges or bombs, and the Thai police inspector at the docks in turn began patrolling Laotian waters, armed and drunk, firing at those that he thought were fishing using these destructive techniques. Fishing, and by extension the realm managed by local authority, is changing. The new landscape of potency is uncertain, and only after this new world emerges can decisions be made. So this landscape of the Mekong intimately involves time. Over a century ago, Marcel Mauss notes how seasonal variation marks life in the Arctic, but in a similar way, we can think about monsoon time. Monsoon-related variation in the flow of the Mekong marks life along it. Time for fishermen is based on the great river's rise and fall, a movement that indicates when actions such as fishing or farming will be efficacious and when they won't. Reading and responding to the river is a vital part of living with it. So on the Mekong, the river is a thing with which one interacts physically as well as socially, with the Lao on the other bank, in other words, or with the Lord of the Fish, an entity I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But this is social as well as physical labor. Just as one learns to deal with their materiality, rapids, eddies, and fish all alike become beings with which one has a kind of a personal relationship. One may come to know Gangpan, a fearsome rapid, but that rapid may also come to know us in a positive or negative way. Incidentally, the picture that you're looking at here is a dry season image of the Mekong River. That's the expanse of the river itself. You can imagine that during the wet, when that just turns into open water, and in recent months, where it's been much drier than even that. But now, things are different. The new dammed Mekong, with an irregular flow, collapsing banks, and disappearing fish, is something else. It is, to draw a term from Anna Tsing, a blasted landscape, a term that's actually literally true for those stretches marred by dynamite fishing, or further upstream, the blasting of boulders to make the river navigable. For Tsing, blasted landscapes are environmentally ravaged, but also productive places, where the dispossessed and vulnerable are able to reforge a kind of relationship with the land, a land that has been damaged by, in her case, capitalism. This is a form of dwelling that is not ideal, nor is it in some kind of imagined perfect harmony. Rather, Tsing emphasizes how we make do with ruins. Tsing describes in her book how the matsutake, a kind of a mushroom, as taking hold in ruined post-industrial landscapes worked by migrants, giving rise to a new nature culture. Not nature, not culture, but nature culture. One that is neither a multi-species Mitsein nor a modernist management of natural resources, but rather simply what manages to live. So the defining feature of the Mekong is its yearly pulse. During the rainy season, a time beginning in June and running until September, and for a few months following, the water melting from the Himalayas joins water pouring in from all of its tributaries to rush down the course of the river. At its peak in September, the river near Banbuk averaged a pulse of about 9 meters. Its pulse begins in June, peaks in September, and trails away in November and December. To put this pulse in context, the dry season of the river averages about a meter deep around these parts. The yearly pulse raises the water level tenfold. These days, of course, numbers like this are always kind of suspect. The pulse does a number of things. Firstly, if you think about the world from the perspective of a fish, it expands it. As the pulse covers over riverbanks, submerges fruit-bearing trees, and deepens tributaries, fish gain access to new feeding and spawning grounds. It's at that time that some catfish breed by moving up smaller streams. These movements are vital to note for fishermen, as the time of year, my interlocutors usually refer to the year by the Buddhist festival that was close enough to it, determines the kind of trap one might use. Secondly, the pulse first inundates, erodes, and then slowly deposits a layer of fine silt down the banks of the river, fortifying its banks and spreading nutrients. And this is important not only for the plants growing in the water, but also for those who live alongside the river, as farmers plant various crops following the water's retreat in what's called flood retreat agriculture for obvious reasons. This involves some degree of risk, especially as the rains become more frequent, but the richness of the soil more than makes up for it. The slope of the bank becomes a kind of a measure of the time it takes for something to grow. You put a large permanent tree somewhere further up towards the top, like a papaya, and smaller, faster growing plants predominate further down. It's a planting schedule that can be incredibly productive, but also has risks when the flood cycle is unpredictable. And now is a moment of risk. The new Mekong has a different time from the old one, and what was once efficacious is no longer. If we were to reframe this statement in theoretical terms, this Mekong, the becoming damned, opens onto a new uncertain field of potentiality. Whereas before 2003, the Mekong rose and fell seasonally. In years since, it has been different, rising and falling, in the words of another fisherman who I name Mon, against nature, Bitamasa. By this, Mon refers to surges in the water level in violation of normal seasonal cycles. In other words, a flood in the absence of rain in March 2015, and an ebb that dropped the river to record low levels in March 2016. These new rhythms are, as I've hinted, they originate when the Chinese controller of the Jinghong Dam decides to retain or release water, decisions that are on principle not communicated downstream. Without the ability to communicate with the Chinese dam, Mon and others in Banbuk can only closely watch the water level for indication that the dam controller has acted. You may ask, is the water very clear today? Is it very red today? Is there a strange foamy thing coming down the river? To how much did it go up last night? How much did it drop? Mon and other fishermen know very well the cause of the floods. There's no mystery that these are as a result of Jinghong, but not whether or not one is coming just then. When the floodgates open, water surges come suddenly in the night, wiping out fishing boats, nets, livestock. Fish disappeared. Mon and other fishermen in Banbuk estimated their 2015 yield was only 30% of what was normal in years before the dam, and that linked the disappearance of the Mekong giant catfish, the babuk, to these changes. These changes also produced changes to popular Buddhist practice. During the height of the dry season, Banbuk, along with Lao villagers from across the river, constructed a temporary village on sandy islands exposed by the water's retreat for the celebration of the Buddhist New Year festival of Songkran. You could sit underneath a roof there, have a couple beers, put your feet in the water, and sit in the sand, and it's a lot of fun. But in April of 2014, one of the sudden and unannounced releases of water from Jinghong descended upon the revelers, sweeping away the festival grounds and destroying millions of baht worth of property. During a lull in 2015, you could still see the debris from this last surge remaining: dead timber and hopelessly tangled nets, construction materials, and things piled high atop rocks midstream. So as the festival village indicates, patterns of rise and fall in the river are one strand of the way that one talks about time on the Mekong. A yearly cyclical calendar punctuated by Buddhist holidays, fishing and farming practices, and the monsoon. The dry season, when the festival village is at its height and these islands emerge up out of the flow, coincides with an abundance of fish, as large fish are easy to catch in low water. And these, in turn, fish catches fuel temple donations, sacrifices to animist river beings, and social events and ritual activities centered upon mobilizing villagers' own potential. Around the same time, the villagers hold a rocket festival, Bun Bang Phai, where large, quite phallic rockets are fired into the sky, triggering the monsoon. By mapping ritual onto the monsoon cycle, rituals also gain the power to yield rain. Later, when the water is near its height, other beings, in turn, act, discharging their own potential. When the rains end, at kind of the inverse of Songkran at the festival Okbansa, Nagas come to the river's surface and spit fire into the air. These fireballs that herald the beginning of the cold and dry season and the decline of the Mekong are notably given the same name, Bangfai, as the rockets that begin the wet. In this way, we can think about it in a certain kind of a light. Land beings act to bring the rise of the water, river beings act to bring about its ebb. Thus, the water-based calendar of the Mekong mobilized the potential and the potency of particular technologies. So, the dam. The dam then alters time on the Mekong. Here, monsoon time and Buddhist time become disrupted via new modes of time when the dam controller decides to open the gates, for instance. In the wake of the dam, the river and those within it become disentangled from the rhythms. You can think about the cycle of the river and the natural world now being linked up to power consumption demands or reservoir levels much further upstream. The Mekong water is no longer linked as strongly to the rain, which in turn delinks it from ritual activity meant to provoke the rains. Fish follow suit, and as the Naga shows, so do river beings. So now, in the wake of a new Mekong, this situated knowledge about how the river works fails, and new practices arise. Moratoriums on fishing in particular seasons have in Bambuk elapsed. These were often religiously based moratoriums upon fishing in these particular deep, wide, swirling pools, the Nong that I described earlier. In response to this falling yield, fishermen compensate for this lack of knowledge on how to handle the new river to experiment with new techniques, the bombs, the car batteries, fish poison, and things like this. As fishermen can no longer trap fish with old methods, and as Naga fireballs, while they still appear, do not bring about a lowering of the water, at least not for any length of time, and as high water comes with or without phallic rockets. River time is disentangled from Buddhist time, monsoon time, and calendric time. Events that are previously simultaneous, rockets, clear water, big fish, are now not. The changes in river time alters the way that fishermen and riverbank farmers deal with the river. Red water comes without fish. The rising river sweeps away crops and planted in anticipation of its decline. In short, now is a very different time in which to dwell, for people, for animals, and as I'll describe, for spirits alike. As with the water, life in the Mekong is constantly in flux. With the water's rise, riverbank areas and the plants growing on them are submerged, becoming a part of the river's food chain. In turn, as these banks are exposed, a thick layer of silt is deposited. This is the reddish-orange sand with surprisingly bright flakes of mica and other metals, and seeing flakes glitter in the water, you're reminded that a gold seam cuts underneath the town. The silt makes the water almost opaque. For most part of the year, especially during times of red water, the water is opaque enough that visibility only extends for a few inches. And so when Mon pulls up his nets, he anticipates what is inside of them by weight and by feel, but not necessarily by sight. The water is a trade-off for plants as well. It's rich in nutrients, but to be submerged is to be choked off from light. As such, there are these plants that live for part of their lives submerged and part exposed, including those shrubs with the bright red fruit that Paul pointed out to me, along with wild floating rice and a kind of an algae that villagers eat, collect, and make into soup. But primarily, people talk about fish. Nearly all of these species, excepting of course those that are introduced, are endangered, and some of them, like the Mekong giant catfish, are critically so. This status seems to matter little to fishermen, though, who do not distinguish between an endangered sheepfish or common tilapia in their nets. Both are meat and both are profit. Additionally, many fishing techniques do not discriminate. Nets, as well as explosives and electricity, kill or stun fish within a radius. In fact, you can't really discriminate on what you're going to catch, even if you wanted to. And the murky river's flow, one cannot see really what one catches. One can anticipate using different techniques, but especially nowadays, all that's uncertain. One makes a guess, chooses a kind of bait or net or both, and gives the rest up to chance, fate, or something beyond your control. Posing another risk to fish, many of these fish have distinct migratory patterns. Catfish that swim up tributaries during the wet season, and many other fish swim up the main stream of the river to spawn. But these movements are triggered by water flow and are sensitive to its fluctuation. And now that's in flux, notwithstanding the direct barrier the hydropower projects place in the path of the migrating fish. So I'm going to get into this fish now. Babuk, the Mekong giant catfish, are enormous beasts that feed largely on algae. On the large end, they can push 300 kilograms in weight, although most are much smaller. Catching a buk is cause for celebration. They can net tens of thousands of baht. Indeed, this is kind of all they bring, owing to their expense and owing to the privately acknowledged poor quality of the meat. Villagers who talked about catching a buk never really mentioned eating it, but always sold it off elsewhere. This, of course, is not legal. The buk is critically endangered, nearly extinct in the wild. At the same time, fish farms growing buk exist in Thailand, and the market for buk meat exists all across the region. Indeed, when I mentioned my fieldwork site, many in Bangkok encouraged me to go and try to find babuk to eat, not seeming to know about the ban. The buk is, in Jakrit Sangkamani's terms, a quasi-object that crystallizes certain networks. For instance, Bong related to me a story that illustrates the role of the buk vis-a-vis religion, religious power, and law. He had a government delegation from Bangkok visiting Ban Buk, and he, as sub-district head, was supposed to entertain them. They had been asking to eat buk, and Bong felt obligated to serve it to them. But no one had caught one in years. He went to the shrine of the Lord of Nagas, behind the temple in Ban Buk, where a newly arrived medium had set up business in a cave. He asked the Naga what to do about this visit, this impending visit, and the Naga, via the medium, called upon him, check your nets the next morning. Sure enough, that next morning there were two small but present buk in his nets. He served the fish to the visiting officials, who were pleased to eat it. Nobody seemed to question the status of the buk, illegal or legal, critically endangered native type jagas, this kind here, or the introduced hybrid, anything like that. While a smaller sized buk can be brought straight into a boat, one cannot lift a several hundred kilogram thing straight out of the water. And thus catching a buk involves at least several men and at least two boats. The men might tow the net into the shallows and lift the thrashing fish up from there, where it could be brought onto land and harvested. It's a community effort. As Durkheim would have it, a communally significant creature is also religiously significant. In 1932, F.H. Giles reported in the Journal of Siam Society that the rites and practices involved in catching the giant babuk. As he writes, in a place that he terms the Golden Basin of Pool, very close to my field site, the chief of Vientiane presides over offerings to something Giles calls the spirit chief, offerings that are in turn passed through a spirit medium. The spirit replies that if the fishermen act in a right and proper way, the catch will be numerous, but if their behavior falls below the proper standard, the catch will be small, that you may not return home empty-handed with your feelings bruised and hurt. So there's a moral register here, as well as the techniques and the religious register too. Some in Ban Buk, Bong, but significantly not Mon, still make an offering to a divine catfish at a place that Giles called the Golden Pool. What I here refer to as Jiao Pa Buk, the Lord of the Fish. Above that deep, supposedly bottomless pool, famous for Pa Buk, was a concrete statue of the fish, as well as an altar where one could make offerings to the fish or to the Naga in order to ask for additional help. So what I want to present here is an ecology in flux tied with a religious and state ritual. What at times is a fishery dominated by a yearly pulse has become one with intermittent pulses of water and crashing fish stocks, largely owing to a disrupted migration. Here, following Tsing and taking a phrase attributed to Gramsci, here comes to be a time of monsters. As the Lord of the Fish and the Naga indicate, the disappearance of fish is not solely an economic problem. Rather, it presents a fundamental religious problem as well. Sources of invisible potential in the river are not what they once were. I want to now turn to my final vignette here. Mon stood on the bank behind his house. He knew that there was something wrong. The surface of the water, just where the bank sloped down behind the temple, had begun to froth and to bubble, like there was something big underneath thrashing around. The disturbance lay right where the village government of Bambuk had brought in heavy machinery in order to fortify the banks of the Mekong River with concrete. Mon and his two sisters stared into the foaming water to see what was causing the disturbance, but the water was opaque. They looked into the froth without being able to make anything out. 2 months later, Mon and I stood on the bank where this happened, looking out across the water. He showed me on his phone the video he took of the foaming river. There was a cave there, he said to me. There was a place where a Naga lived, as we watched the water bubble on the tiny screen. My sister, she saw one sunning itself right there on the bank. And then when the district began construction, all that activity, it must have blocked the mouth of the cave. This video is evidence of the Naga trying to get out. Mon speculated that the Naga had died, trapped inside the cave, entombed in the bank. But afterwards, Mon and his sisters considered the sandy construction site a place where one could contact the dead spirit of the Naga. They brought down incense sticks, sweetened coffee, Fanta, soda, and fruits placed on the sand, asking the Naga for a better price for the rubber harvest. The village administration, too, after hearing of the collapse, came to promise the Naga spirit a festival complete with electrified Lao country music, Mo'alam, in compensation so that misfortune from the accident wouldn't taint the town. The loss of Nagas is not simply Mon's story here, though. As another fisherman said, Nagas used to come up out of the river. They would come into town, put on human clothes, and come to the temple to listen to Buddhist chanting. Sometimes they might even marry women from the village, but then they stopped. He paused and I pressed him, why did they stop? But he responded quite simply, they got tired of us. Elsewhere, other river beings underwent similar transformations. A Lao-style medium was a very similar sort of religious professional who featured in the book rights 100 years ago, was the voice of an island king, a spirit that looked after the village and sent catches of fish to villagers' nets, but who found herself openly mocked at her possession ritual when I was conducting my fieldwork. Whereas a new male Bangkok-style medium who lived an ascetic's life in a cave behind Bantong's temple gained adherents, including Bong. Old orders based around the river and fish, old deities, slip away to be replaced by the representative of a new order and the Mekong's new flow, and as well becomes intimately tied in with the flows of international migrant labor. The removal of these religious figures from the physical realm, think about the physical Naga, including the realm of kinship and participation in communal religious activity, suggests a shift in materiality. The physical Naga becomes a ghostly one, but a ghost that points not towards the uncanny or towards haunting or towards horror, but to the presence of new promises and new possibilities that even as another way of being declines. It's a shift that occurs as the workings of neoliberal capitalism multiply in Bambuk, as rubber prices rise and fall, as migrant labor becomes more tenuous, and as the political future of the Northeast grows more in doubt. But more than this, the natural world itself has changed, as the formerly predictable Mekong full of beings with which one had a particular relationship becomes a new kind of a place. But even as all that is solid melts into air, it does not disappear. As established economic and environmental orders fail and new, miraculous, or catastrophic horizons of possibility open up, new cosmological worlds are born. So, in conclusion here, through a micro-examination of the impacts of Chinese hydropower upon one small fishing community, a place one of my external reviewers of Mekong Dreaming called profoundly unimaginative and ordinary, I seek to show the scale of such things, such changes. The collapse of the Mekong under new hydropower projects creates alterations that can escape notice if we only think about the Mekong as a confluence of national interests. Bangkok, Beijing, and Vientiane might very well benefit from the alterations taking place in the river. Thailand invests its national interest in the capital, and Laos seeks to become, as it describes, the battery of Asia. But for Bong, Mon, and others that I discuss here, such changes involve multiple different registers. The hydrology of the river changes. Its color, movement, and even the way one marks space on the river and one marks time on the river changes. Ways of marking space and time, ways of dividing territory are lost. Ways of relating to the other inhabitants of the river, fish and spirits, disappear to be replaced by, as I describe further in my book, new hybrids, new spirits, and new sources of power. In short, as infrastructure itself alters the way the world works, new sources of potential, prosperous as well as disastrous potential, become revealed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. So now we can open things up for questions, and you can either put things in the chat or you can just speak up. Andrew, why don't you share your screen so that we can see everybody? There you go. Okay, great. Yeah, so anybody want to start us off? Any questions, comments? Ake?
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew, for the talk there. Fascinating. So I think it's interesting to think about, you know, the changing lives and livelihoods of people based on the changing materiality of the river, and you talking about people's kind of understanding and relationships to the non-human world is fascinating as well. And thinking about kind of a new spirits. So I'm wondering about, is there some sort of, or maybe what you found in your field work, some sort of resistance to some of this new spirits? Are there still segments of the population that are still kind of patroning the like Del Bambuk and the Island King, or is there still some sort of hope that their potency is still there, and how is that kind of enacted in everyday life there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think that it has a complicated answer. And like I mean, we tend to think about politics being a very complicated thing on the macro scale, but my God, if you get down to like politics amongst a village of 30 households, it gets crazily intensely complicated. So yes, so there's different groups of people do gravitate towards different religious figures, and there's a sort of a it becomes gendered in a particular way. So and also becomes cut by whether or not one has gone abroad to do migrant labor. So migrant labor is the missing part of this presentation. I wanted to focus mostly on the river, but migrant labor is a huge impact and upon all across the Northeast, and then within the community as well. You've got certain either migrant labor or having a spouse that is abroad and sending remittances back, or has a person in the family who has moved abroad and sending remittances back. So for those, for people who were deeply invested in migrant labor, they were the ones who really saw a large turning away from that kind of the traditional form of mediumship. Part of this too is about exposure to Central Thai forms of I'm a little uncomfortable with the word animist, but I'll use it here just to to refer to that quality of mediums and spirits and this kind of register. So for people who had lived for a long time in Bangkok, or kind of become acquainted with Central Thai ways of doing things, or even Cambodian style ways of doing things, there was a movement away from kind of the traditional Laotian style mediums, who were generally older women. And the new guy was a middle-aged man, but he was also from the central region, and he sort of really dressed the part. For me, he was also very, very convincing as well. But he really dressed the part of wearing all white, prayer beads, long gray hair, and kind of looked very much like a rasi, like a holy hermit. So Migrant labor is one dividing line. There's also within environmental circles as well. I worked for a time with a environmental NGO that would occasionally come through the area, and they were very much into finding the traditional mediums and sort of supporting them too. But they also had different expectations and different understandings, and they wanted the mediums to talk very much about dams and about the river and about very politically oriented things. Whereas for the people who had kept on patronizing the traditional mediums, they wanted to talk about more property disputes, more inter-village politics and things like this. So there's a number of different divides in there between kind of internationally focused workers and nationally focused NGOs and then sort of the community around there. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, just thinking about that, the inter-village dynamic there is interesting.
Yeah,
and the gendered aspect of as well. Thank you.
Oh, I didn't mention gendered. Yeah, so for a lot of the traditional mediums, they were women, and a lot of the people who went to them were women as well, and the men liked this new guy a lot more. Oh, there's a question here from Trudy Renwick of UC Berkeley. You mentioned that villagers don't care too much about different national governments involved. However, I'm also curious if you could expand upon the different attitudes and dynamics among different Thai government officials and agencies towards each other and handling some of these issues, both with the villagers' new fishing methods as well as officials in China and Laos. Yeah, so the comment of Bokyo of it's not really, don't worry about the governments from the fishermen, usually had to do with whether or not you were going to go to the Laos side and throw your nets, or whether or not, hey, it's a holy day here in Thailand, but in Laos, they have a different calendar. That means the bar is open over there. Let's go. And the kind of like moving between the border as not a major thing. But clearly it is as well. I mean, clearly nations can suddenly assert themselves very readily. There was a dock there in town, which was staffed, had an army post staffed next to it too. And that was definitely something where it was a potential point of friction. So the government officials, the only government officials that I really interacted with in my study were the village heads, the Puyai Ban, the kind of like, what would you call it? It's not a mayor, but it's a smaller scale official. And that's Bong. That's somebody who also doesn't really, who sees the state as kind of a background sort of a thing. In terms of officials coming in from Bangkok or coming in from Nong Khai or, Khon Kaen or the larger areas, clearly nation means a lot. And if you focus on the place that you can see that most clearly is in the infrastructure, especially Cold War era infrastructure right along the river. Highways came in the 1980s. Nice, clear mountaintop vistas were placed by the army and at places where you could look over into Laos and, potentially either put a piece of artillery up there or at least a guy with binoculars. So there's the border as a kind of a resource for infrastructure coming from more centralized forms of government. It's definitely a thing that goes on. How that impacts people's everyday lives is in a very different way. It wasn't always so. There was a war in the 80s between Thailand and Laos, a small border war, but villagers talked about that time as being a time when if you wanted to go to the island to make an offering to the Jiao Da and to the Island King, you would have to look out. You have to be careful. You have to do it at night. You couldn't do it all the time. And further, there's always the potential for violence across the border, not state violence, but just disputes. Especially disputes over somebody fishing in somebody else's plot, or somebody especially using grenades or car batteries in somebody else's fishing plot. That always threatens to spill over and is usually resolved outside of state capacity. Hope that.
We have a hand raised.
Okay.
Oh, that would be me, I think. So I have a question about this kind of like new cosmological, I guess, evolution concerning like the changing of river topography. Is that using like Anna Singh terminology? Is that a kind of eschatological vision of how how the river could create a apocalypse, or like a kind of precarity that the river people, the fisher people in the Bible book is living with, because I could foresee how this kind of a dry out river could create a idea that the river will be gone and something like that. So I kind of want to understand if there's that kind of like an incoming apocalypse vision among the people.
There's certainly precedents for apocalyptic and revolutionary discourse, specifically in this area. You've got the Holy Man revolts in the early 20th century, which was a kind of a millenarian movement saying that an entirely new ontological order was on the horizon, and it would sweep through the land and reshape all the relations that we have between people and animals and economy and everything like this. This was also a very, very red. I think Patana Kitiasa describes this as areas moving from red to red. So it was communist and now it's red shirt. But that also had within it its own clearly revolutionary, not necessarily not apocalyptic at all, but a revolutionary sort of a vision. What is different now, I think, is that the actual material conditions are changing. The way the river works changes. So it's not just an economic disruption, but it seems to be everything. People talk, I mean, there's a lot of despair. I think in another article, I talk about the idea of waiting and the despair that comes with waiting for something to change. And if you recall, talking about the nets being strung in the water, Bong describes the fishermen as waiting, just waiting to see. And waiting for what? They're waiting maybe to get another net, but they're also waiting for the dams to be over. They're waiting for the instability to stop, and that's not going to happen. And everybody knows likely that it's not going to happen. So between apocalyptic fears of the dam suddenly breaking and everything being wiped away, being the fears of the river drying up, I think there is both a sense of despair, but also a pragmatism that comes along with that. Is that I mean, if there's one thing people in that region and I guess people a lot of places are infinitely pragmatic when you get down to it, and so yes, things are bleak, but what do we do about it is always the thing that comes out. So there's a bit of the you can work through Tsing in a way. In that light, in that what do we make do with this new landscape? But I think also where I think I differ a bit from Tsing is that using a car battery to fish, everybody knows that this is not kind of a new way of being. This is a highly destructive way of being. This is not something that is going to further any kind of apocalyptic fears that you have, not create a new sense of being. Can I answer one on the chat?
Yeah, there's one. Let's go to Catherine's question on the chat. Yeah.
So Catherine Bowie writes, really enjoyed your talk. Could you elaborate more? The payments paid for the rights to fish, who gets the money, origins of the practice? Origins of the practice, I don't know exactly when it started. It started before anybody that I talked to remembered, but there's two spiral boat notebooks. One is held by the Puyai Ban of the Thai side, and one is held by the Puyai Ban of the Lao side, and they match. Hopefully they match up between the two, or they meet together at times to make sure that they match up. And they've got a price listed. And that price is paid when so let's say you were going to make some sort of a deal with somebody else. Let's say, I want to fish in your plot. You are too busy to fish in your plot. So I'm going to lease the plot out from you, or I'll purchase the plot from you. That price, we have come up to a price. We go up to the Puyai Ban and record it in the books. So it is a private ownership thing, at least for those. There are also Tisa Tarana. There's also public fishing sites too, which are also determined by the Puyai Ban or by the side. So there's always a place to fish if you do not have your own position. Now, they're not very good places to fish, and they're never a place that you can actually drop a net. But the prices are set between the buyer and seller there too. And then further, there would have been a religious site. The Nong Jiao Pabut would have been a religious site, the deep pool. That, however, ended in the 1980s. That ended a while ago.
I'll just add that the same system is also used in Laos when it's not along the border. So people that live along the Con Falls area have the same kind of system. They use the same vocabulary. They call them luang mong in the same way. And they also buy and sell and rent out these locations in the same way that Andrew has talked about. I think the difference for Andrews is it's along the border, and therefore it's a more coordinated thing between the two sides. Whereas where I've seen it, it's just within a community or between a few communities.
I was not aware of this private ownership part of the story. So can you add some more, like, how did private ownership of the river get started, and what happens with the money? Who gets to decide how to spend it? Is it used for any common good, or is this considered somehow completely at the discretion of the owner?
It goes to the owner. It doesn't. The money doesn't get put into the muban. It goes directly to the owner of the plot. So it is a way of rent seeking. It is a way, at least in the way that it has manifested now, and it may have been different at a different point in time, but at least the way it's manifested amongst my interlocutors, it's a way that somebody who is, at least before the crash in the fisheries, a way that somebody who owned a lot of capital already and owned a lot of plot and was an influential family member could do that. And it also doesn't exactly help the case that many of the people who are wealthy and influential are also either the Puyaiban of the village or are the Gamnan or somebody, above, sorry, we're using Thai village ranks, but the district head or somebody above the village head status. So that's also something that plays into it. It's hard to separate out. When you have powerful and influential, at least in the village level, families, it becomes hard to separate out what goes into the group coffers and what kind of gets used for family use. I see there's a question here from Benny Bauman from Heidelberg University. Is there really no concept of sustainable fishing in Bambuk? The Taiban project documents that subsistence fishers along the Mekong do have local concepts of sustainable fishing. I think there's a concept of sustainable fishing, certainly. The idea of moratoriums at a certain time of year, the idea of certain areas being set aside for fish to rest and to spawn and things like that is clearly sustainable. But having a concept of it and doing it are two different things. And having a concept of it and doing it in the situation where you have a massively irregular flow of water and a absolutely disrupted ecosystem is yet another thing. So there are certainly, if you drive your boat up the river and start dropping explosives into the water, people are going to come out and watch you and mutter about who you are, and maybe you're from that side of the bank or maybe you're from this side of the bank. You don't do it right across from your own hometown. So there is a certain social stigma against doing anything terribly destructive. However, people do it, and people often do it, and they accuse each other of doing it. The only action that I've seen taken against things like explosive fisheries is the chief inspector of the Thai police, who would be down at the dock, would go out on his boat and try to scare off anybody who was doing these things. But it was not done on a systematic basis, and it was, I think, something he may have done more for fun than anything else, really. But it was not a deterrent in a way that actually worked at all. So having a concept of it and advocating for it and coming together, certainly this project had a lot of political advocacy in it as well that I haven't talked about here, but there were groups of fishermen who were really pushing for sustainable fishing practices, and by which they saw an end to harmful fishing, end to explosives fishing, and some kind of thing worked out with, or a moratorium on dams or some kind of mitigation coming in from hydropower projects. They were very much David's to, Jing Hong's Goliath, and still are. Now they largely document what is happening, but there's certainly a concept, and certainly a push for it, and certainly a political drive for it, and something that I personally feel very invested in as well, and many of my interlocutors do. But it's definitely not the majority of people. It's definitely not the majority. It's definitely not the direction that things are going. Then he follows up. What about releasing the caught spaces and spawning season or creating spawning grounds? Yeah, releasing fish is a thing, but again, there are fish farms, and there are in fact there's state efforts to do fish farms, especially for babut. But these are also oftentimes done at the behest of particular political actors within the state for profit and things like this too. And none of these were local. These are things that one could do, but is not done at least in babut.
Can you hear me? Not that it bears immediately on Andrew's points, but in fact, Jing Hong is the lowermost dam on the Mekong and in the Lansang, which is what the Chinese call it. There are 5 major dams upstream now of Jing Hong, and the reservoir of Jing Hong is only about 0.3 cubic kilometers, which isn't a hell of a lot. If the gates were fully open to that reservoir would completely drain in about 24 hours at 300 cumecs of discharge. By comparison, Xiao Wang, which is started about the same time, but considerably upstream, has nearly 50 times the volume. It's about 15 million cubic meters. And the management of Jing Hong really is a reflection of what the Chinese are releasing further up basin than what's actually happening at the bottom of the river at Jing Hong. Jing Hong was notable because it was the first dam across the Mekong mainstream. And now inside Laos, we have Xayaburi, which has been online probably for about a year. And I don't think there's been any posting of the research, if any, on what the effects of the fishery on the fisheries downstream of Xayaburi have happened since then. I don't know, Ian might know something more about that, but I can't believe that they've run this thing for a year and nobody knows exactly what's happening immediately below it.
Well, they're never going to know because they collected no baseline data before they built the dam. So how are they going to be able to say what the impacts are? It's actually, that's the hoax of the whole thing, is that you don't collect data and then you claim you don't know later, and that's exactly what they're creating a sense where they can't be blamed because they never really knew to begin with. It's an unfortunate situation that nobody, despite the fact that there were many years that they could have done that and a lot of complaints, but yet there was never a proper fisheries data collection program set up in relation to that project.
Yeah, I want to second what Ian said right there. I believe the impact, the MRC, or the Mekong River Commission, requires an impact study to be done several kilometers up and downstream, and mostly thinking about inundation upstream. Is that correct? And does not, there's not a lot of attention done further downstream. And further, there's not a whole lot of fisheries work done on, there's some in Cambodia and further down, but the middle and upper Mekong areas are understudied when it comes to ecological work.
Yeah. It wasn't so much that the MRC requires a certain type of environmental impact. It's the Lao government that sets the rules for that. But the only thing that the MRC governs is the basin-wide assessment that they're supposed to do, and also the consultations related to individual projects. So there was a 6 months consultation on Xayaburi, but there's no veto power. So even though people were still concerned, they went ahead with it anyway.
The MRC, incidentally, as you probably know, none of the MRC only requires that the member countries, which notably do not include China or Burma, but Burma only has a very minor connection with the Mekong. But the MRC member countries are only required to notify the other members of what they have in mind, and none of them have veto power over the plans of the other. Otherwise, nobody would have joined the MRC.
Yeah.
Well, it's a little bit different, Alan. It's notification is only required for tributaries. For the mainstream dams, they require the consultation process, right? But for tributaries, it's just notification. Other questions? Anybody else have anything else or comments? I just want to ask Andrew one thing that I was thinking about. You know, you told that story about a guy who was having all those government officials show up and was wondering how he was going to be able to feed them babuk. And I'm wondering, I'm guessing that he did not catch 2 babuks in that net, as you suggested. He probably caught 2 other catfish and just claimed that they were babuk, and knowing that the government officials wouldn't be able to identify them, and fed it to them and told them it was babuk when it was probably another type of Pangasius catfish that looked kind of similar. And so just by telling them that he'd had it, that was sufficient. Do you think there's any possibility that my suspicion would be true?
You know, I don't think so, to be entirely honest. And there's a complication here because there's a hybrid species that is also has been introduced and is kind of released now, and that becomes a thing which is a bit more commonly caught. It's not going to be the monster that you see in those images. And so oftentimes if you catch a hybrid, you say, you know, like we've got a book. Now
the hybrids are found in the mainstream now.
Yeah, you can find the hybrids there.
Okay, because they're not in the lower part. You don't see them down below at all.
That's all, yeah.
Yes, they're up there. Yeah.
So the thing, the reason why I think it was actually it resulted in him really become a religious convert to this guy behind the temple. So that finding those 2 book in the nets really changed his outlook and deepened his confidence in this new medium who had set up shop behind the temple before he had gone to the Nangtiam, the image that I had earlier, the kind of more traditional Laotian style medium. But after finding those pabuk, he was sold on the other guy. So had it not led to kind of a deep personal transformation on his part, I might, you know, also be skeptical. And also this guy is anyway, he's not so much. There's other people in town that I would trust less, but this guy I believe that he believes.
I have a question, not concerning your I guess your presentation, but your incoming project. I just kind of want to, if that's okay with the moderators, I kind of want to hear like maybe a synopsis, because that's kind of my direction of my PhD.
Sure, it's the whole project. I've done some preliminary work, and so now the whole project is on hiatus. But in short, I was interested in looking at communities, and so working with the BMA, as well as the Bangkok Metropolitan Association, as well as with communities that define themselves as rivers, as canal side communities, and looking at the issue of waste in the water, looking at how that becomes both an excuse to drive people out, as well as kind of a metaphor for talking about people, and the idea of trash in the water and waste generation, and then also the role of canals in the planning of Bangkok, the settlement of communities along certain canals, mosques, other things like this, and finally reading a whole lot of Suntonpu and, you know, like classic early Ratanakosin poetry surrounding canals, water, the affect of water, the dream life of water, and other things like that.
See, I have a suspicion that a lot of people in the elite of Bangkok Metropolitan Authority, as well as people who are, you could describe as like upper middle class or middle class Bangkok, sees the people living in the I guess the Klong slum as an extension of the human waste in the river. Would you describe that as like, oh, I guess fair description?
I don't know yet, but that would be that pretty much that exact idea would be something that I would not be surprised to hear. But it would be, you know, I would want to go a bit deeper in that, but I think that would be what, you know, one might anticipate, especially it may have to do with the political situation of Bangkok at that particular time. Certainly in 2010, you would probably hear a lot more kind of aggressive Salim discourse.
We are coming to the end of our time. Do we have any more questions? We have one comment coming in from Trudy Renwick. You should read the work of Hayden Shelby. She works on slum upgrading in Bangkok and different organizations connected to the BMA and government working on this. I mentioned this so you can look at that comment before we close the chat. And you can't see it anymore. This talk has been recorded and will be available on our website. And I would like to show a hand of applause. We can't really hear it, but thank you so much for a really terrific talk. Ian, do you have any more comments?
No, I'd just like to thank Andrew very much for giving a very interesting talk. And I have lots of things to talk to him about, but I decided not to ask too much right now, but maybe I'll give him a call later or something. But thank you so much for showing up. It's a very important issue, and I appreciate bringing your kind of anthropological lens to look at it.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me as well. It's been a really real pleasure.